We have about 30 participants today. Welcome to the IRES Thursday seminar series, everyone. We have two extremely bright PhD students from IRES presenting part of their research today with us. We have Rocío López de Lama, who is supervised by Professor Kai Chan, and we have Madison Stevens, who's co-supervised by Professor David Boyd and Professor Jeanette Bulkin. Rocío will be going first, followed by Madison. Each of them will present for about 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of a Q&A session. Before we start, as customary, I would like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge that you're joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Kai to introduce Rocío.
Thank you, Kishank. This is great. It's a pleasure to introduce Rocío. She's an Ocean Leaders Fellow, and she's been with us for now over 3 years. Started in January of 2018, I guess, which is an unusual time to start. And Rocío is an unusual student. She's working intensely has been working intensely in the field, and her project was intended to be a field-based project in Peru. And she and Rumi both had just passed had their proposals accepted to go off to their various parts of the world in February, I believe, of 2020. And then you know what happened. So Rocío has regrouped, and you'll hear the story about that. But yeah, I mean, you should think about Rocío whenever you think about Peru, both in terms of the work that she'll talk about, as well as work that she's done on the fisheries side, and some really great pieces connecting, the kind of historical understanding of how these cultures have developed to the current day. So both in terms of fisheries and the land. So it's a pleasure to introduce Rocío, and I look forward to her talk, which I've already heard, and I'm looking forward to hearing again.
Great, thanks Kai for that kind introduction. Okay, so I will start sharing my screen. Cool. Well, hi everyone, I'm excited to be here. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm in Lima, Peru. This coastal land once belonged to the Lima people, fishers and farmers who left us an incredible cultural legacy regarding the ocean and marine species. Before being conquered by the Inca Empire and then by the Spaniards. The results I will share with you today are still a work in progress. I'm currently coding my interviews, and the things you will see are only scratching the surface. So this is going to be an early opportunity for feedback that I will truly appreciate. All the participants have given me their permission to share their pictures. And so yeah, let's get started. Well, as we all know, we're currently living through a global conservation crisis, which does not only imply a severe ecological degradation, as we can see on the map to the right, but also an increasing disconnection between humans and nature. One of the mainstream tools for protecting and defending nature are government-run protected areas, or PAs, which have followed a fine and fences approach for decades now. However, governments have their own limitations, such as financial resources, human capacity, and enforcement mechanisms, and cannot protect all of what is needed. Thus, we need to complement governmental efforts with private initiatives. Both Mari and myself will be exploring different types of voluntary and locally led conservation initiatives in today's seminar. One type of private land conservation tool are privately protected areas, or PPAs. According to IUCN, a PPA is a protected area under private governance. The LY was added in 2018 to highlight the fact that although they are private efforts, we all benefit from the conservation endeavor. There are thousands of PPAs in the world, and recently there has been a surge of them worldwide, particularly in Latin America. But until not so long ago, PPAs have remained a largely hidden resource, being ignored by some governments and omitted from international conservation reporting mechanisms. Literature on PPAs has mainly focused on the motivations behind their creation and management, as well as on the level of program satisfaction associated with them. However, literature focuses heavily on 4 Western countries, which are not representative of the global context in terms of what incentives and support governments provide for PPAs. Thus, relying on this literature for trying to understand these global phenomena might lead to inadequate conclusions. With this in mind, I decided to explore and understand PPAs in Peru, my home country. Peru is home to 2 of the biodiversity hotspots and has 84 of the 104 ecosystems that are found on the planet. Sadly, as a developing country, it faces ongoing pressures for quote-unquote development that continuously threatens nature and people's relationship with it. So government efforts can only focus on the 17% of the country that is already protected, under protected areas, which leaves many ecosystems underrepresented and vulnerable. PPAs in Peru were legally recognized only in 2001. PPAs can be created by either individuals, families, local communities, businesses, NGOs, and they can be set up temporarily or in perpetuity. Thus, some PPAs might not be renewed. Despite that, the cumulative number of PPAs per year has been on the rise ever since the recognition, as you can see on the bottom right graph. Peru is an interesting case study on PPAs, mainly because there is no PPA program in the country. This means that there are no incentives nor support given by the government. PPAs are not even considered part of the National Protected Area System. So if you have a PPA, you're basically on your own. Furthermore, the process to create a PPA can be quite lengthy and expensive. By 2020, there were about 143 PPAs in Peru, 50% of them owned by individuals and families, which currently are protecting about 385,000 hectares. Okay, so within this context, this question was in my head for a long time before even starting the PhD, which was, what is driving people, individuals and families in particular, to create and manage a PPA, especially within the context of no apparent incentives where an instrumental logic would prevail. By an instrumental logic, I mean that people would engage in conservation and see it benefits them in some way, perhaps economically or legally. So maybe people are acting based on notions of adequate or desired relationship with nature, which we know as relational values. This led me to the following research questions. First, my first research question is, how do land managers describe the origin story of their PPA? Second, what do land managers see as salient elements of the land that they are protecting? Then, what is achieved once they have created a PPA? And perhaps if tenure security is a potential incentive to create PPAs, do they actually contribute to it and how? Finally, more of a theoretical kind of question, what do land managers' stated motivations reveal about their personal values, instrumental and relational regarding nature? As I'm still in the initial phase of my analysis, I won't be showing any results for the last question. In terms of methods, as Kai mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic presented a huge setback on my original plans for conducting fieldwork. I wanted to spend about 3 to 4 months in the field, interviewing people, visiting PPAs, mostly up here in this region, which ended up creating an opportunity for a broader and different type of sample, focusing only on those PPAs run by families and individuals. Thus, in order to answer my research question, I conducted semi-structured interviews via Zoom, phone calls with land managers throughout the entire country. Interviews lasted on average 60 to 90 minutes, and 32 land managers agreed to participate. The interview explored different aspects of PPAs, creation, management, as well as land managers' commitment and vision regarding PPAs. For my analysis, I'm taking a grounded theory approach, coding my interviews in an inductive way, as well as having the end goal of generating a new theory based on my data. Okay, so findings. To start with my findings, here's a brief description of land managers' profile. So who are these people? First, 60% of my participants identify themselves as males and on average have 50 years old. The highest level of education most people have is a university or institute degree, followed by a postgraduate studies. From the professional participants, only a few had a career related to conservation, meaning biology or even like being veterinarians. But because there were only a few, it means that on my pool of participants, I had lawyers, architects, and even health doctors have their own PPA. In terms of where the people are from, the majority, about 60% of them, are local. This means that they are from the area where the PPA is located, followed by people who have migrated from the capital city, Lima, to another region in Peru, and only 2 of my participants were foreigners. It is important to note that no one here is a millionaire. At most, some could be considered as upper middle class. And to better illustrate this, I have the following quote. Many of my friends tell me that I would be the richest man in Iquitos if we would take advantage of the sandbank within the PPA. We have a huge sandbank that would solve all of my problems. I'm telling you, Rocío, yes, I would secure all of my needs for life and even probably the life of my sons. So this is a land manager that has 46 years old. And he's referring to all his financial problems that could be solved if he just sold his PPA. In terms of the PPA's profile, well, currently they are protecting multiple types of ecosystems throughout the country. Most land managers have bought the land themselves, while a third of them have inherited the land from their family, which can be best illustrated through this quote. My mom, when I was little, she saw that I really enjoyed the land. I was amazed by a butterfly, a dragonfly. Even the ants and bees were incredible for me. I loved it. One day she took me to the land and told me, I want you to protect this. I will give you this land, but never sell it. I thanked her greatly. About 38% of all PPAs are a family initiative. This means mom, dad, sisters are all behind it. And also, the majority had the land for over 10 years before creating the PPA. This implies that people were protecting nature long before they decided to declare the land as a PPA. And the oldest owned land dates from 1897, which corresponds to the early stages of the Peruvian Republic. For the majority, PPAs are either their home or are very close to their home. And most of them are less than 100 hectares in size. Now, bringing back my first research question about the origin story of PPAs, there was a prevailing narrative among land managers that I have identified as a hero's journey. This starts with a question of how they end up managing the land, where participants reflected on meaningful childhood experiences, while others on the importance of continuing their family legacy. Then, when asked what motivated them to protect the land, participants reflected on key experiences, either positive or negative, that triggered the desire to protect nature. By dark past, I mean that some land managers were illegal gold miners or loggers themselves, or others went through trauma that was brought up when answering the motivation question. For example, one female land manager told me that her father was already protecting their forest and refused to let land dealers invade it. In retaliation, land dealers accused her father of being a terrorist, which ended up in a violent episode. And here's her quote. The army, without any compassion, without asking, took my father away 3 times. Once they tortured my father, they locked me and my sisters in the kitchen while they tortured him in another room. These memories make us stronger and pushes us to continue doing what we like the most. Besides her, many participants have reflected on how terrorism impacted them, their families, and land. These episodes ended up in a personal realization that they needed to actively do something to protect nature or make amends with it. Especially as in Peru, it is obvious that if nature has no level of legal protection, it will eventually get destroyed. This then led to people's determination to create and manage a PPA. However, it is after creating a PPA when the challenges start. Land managers will face ongoing challenges regarding management, which can be either due to internal factors, lack of skills, economic resources, or external ones, development pressure, illegal activities. And despite all of these challenges, land managers continue to be 100% committed to keep protecting nature. I will explore this level of commitment later on the presentation. In terms of my second question, when I asked land managers what would I see or experience if I went to their PPA, multiple elements were mentioned, and I have started to identify key relationships that land managers have with them. To mention a few, land managers were proud of the biodiversity that their land holds, highlighting the fact that they are unique species, endemic, vulnerable, and even new to science. Some mentioned that the landscape is beautiful or that it is an example of a well-conserved forest, while others highlighted the uniqueness of their PPA in a spiritual and magical sense. Salient elements were not only biodiversity-oriented, but also related to their family, reflecting on how their land conveys a strong sense of family attachment, while others express their land as a place where one can be happy or feel love and also be able to reconnect with nature. One quote I would like to share with you is the following. Once I found a green worm and it had a tail just like a peacock. It was amazing. There was a rotting tree that we managed to save. That tree is fluorescent. It shines with a green light at night. It is like you are watching Avatar. Spider webs coming out from all over the tree, orange with red, like if the spiders are woven with colors. This quote gives us a sense of how this participant perceives her forest as a magical and unique place. In terms of what is achieved when creating the PPA, I'm developing the idea of a PPA as place. Almost all of my participants are engaging in some type of land restoration, mainly by conducting reforestation projects. Others are engaging in outside-the-box activities, such as setting up a water fountain for wildlife, so animals avoid getting out of the PPA looking for water, or farming certain types of veggies and fruit, so wildlife increases, plus it encourages natural seed dispersion. PPAs are also seen as a place where research and patrolling can contribute to its restoration and adequate management. In terms of how land managers perceive their PPA, many see it as a refuge for wildlife or as a last standing forest among a landscape development, while others see opportunities for recovering locally extinct species. When asked about their vision for the land, the majority stated that they wanted their PPA to be a model for a different type of development, a sustainable one. This included being a model in terms of organic agriculture, ecotourism, and even economic activities. Finally, after hearing about the activities and actions land managers are engaging with thanks to their PPA, one could make the claim that many PPAs are taking on roles that otherwise would be the government's responsibility, thanks to their influence on local communities and neighbors. For instance, many PPAs are conducting environmental education initiatives with local communities and schools. Others are providing training and employment to local people, while even some land managers are actively engaging in the management of government-run PPAs that might be close to their PPAs. In terms of land tenure, all the participants stated that they decided to create the PPA as a way to add an extra layer of legal security to their land. However, despite having the property rights and the legal recognition of being a PPA, land managers reflected on the fact that their land tenure is still weak. So many PPAs have good relationship with their neighbors and local communities, although in some cases, locals might go inside the PPA for hunting, harvest, but overall, local communities mostly engage in lower impact activities regarding the PPA. However, perceived weak land tenure is best illustrated when PPAs are severely damaged by outsiders. By outsiders, I mean land dealers and people involved in organized crime that have invaded part of the PPA or have severely destroyed it, as you can see on the top left picture. Also, despite their recognition, multiple PPAs are currently facing infrastructure threats pushed by governmental authorities in collaboration with private enterprises. The picture from the bottom left is an image being used for an online petition created by the land manager of Fundo Las Neblinas, who is currently fighting the national government to stop plans for thousands of kilometers of electric towers that would not only affect his PPA, but multiple protected areas within the region. No one can really explain how the government granted an initial level of approval for a project like this, which would imply some corruption at different ministries in the country. So besides my findings pertaining my research questions, there are some interesting things that are coming up during this initial phase of analysis. First, death threats and violent acts against managers and their PPAs are frequent. This year alone, 10 environmental defenders have been murdered in Peru, so it's no surprise that PPAs are exposed to this level of violence. As a response mechanism, PPAs are self-organizing into regional networks so they can report such threats anonymously. Second, there are some land managers that have an interesting level of commitment with their PPA, which I'm identifying as hardcore conservationists. These people are struggling with an internal conflict between doing conservation as they deem appropriate and making their PPA financially sustainable. For instance, some people refuse to do ecotourism as this might scare wildlife while struggling to economically support their PPA. Others have sold their house or cars to have economic resources to keep the PPA afloat. Finally, land managers are driving satisfaction from meaningful experiences with animals and plants by knowing that they are providing humanity with clean water or air, and when they see that their actions have inspired others to also engage in nature conservation. One quote that best illustrates this is the following: "We have an amazing story with a baby vulture. We took him and he grew up in our shelter. We're a bit tired of it, until one day a couple of adult vultures came flying and did a dance. The baby flew towards them, the three flew together, such a dance, and then the baby came back. He stayed for a couple of days more, and then the adults came back and all 3 left. There are vultures that fly over our shelter, and I guess one of them is a baby. It's a sign of hope that we are doing things right. So despite the multiple challenges and pressures PPAs are facing, participants are 110% committed to keep going. As the legal figure does not provide any type of apparent support, some land managers are unsure if they will renew the contract. However, everyone is certain that they won't sell the land no matter what to keep protecting it. From my initial thinking process, this level of commitment might be a product of having a strong sense of place attachment to the land, together with a sense of responsibility towards their family or nature. They have no hope in the capacity of the Peruvian government to conserve and protect nature as it should, which is fair enough, while finding some level of value action alignment within the PPA. The following quote can better illustrate this. For me, coming here was a radical change. All my life was spent in Lima, and only after 4 months of coming here for the first time, I decided to move here. If you know what you want to achieve, then the key thing is to know that it can be done and not to be afraid. I have done this when I was 55 years old. Next year I'm turning 58, and I could think that my life is over, that I'm too old, but no. I have come here without savings, only with my work, and everything I earn is invested here. It can be seen as risky by some, but I'm certain that when you work hard, you can achieve whatever you want. So, going back to the title of my presentation, why I think these people are crazy. Simple, it's because these people, they're crazy in the sense that despite all of the challenges, sacrifices, and threats that they face in regards to their PPA, they are still committed and passionate about it, where giving up is not an option for them. Finally, in terms of policy implications, I just want to highlight one thing due to time, and it's that many of these land managers perceive the word private as a problem. Private usually implies having economic resources and capacities for your endeavor. However, the majority of Peruvian land managers are actually struggling to achieve financial sustainability for their PPA. Many are worried about their PPA's future after they are gone. Therefore, many have started to actually use the term voluntary land conservation rather than privately protected areas to better portray their efforts. So that's it. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear them. And I would like to thank my supervisor, Kai Chan, and all of my committee members, as well as my funders and Peruvian and local partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocío. That is such an inspiring story, and yeah, reminds me of, you convincing me to do this research on this area that where virtually no research had been done about why these people were doing this, and it's great to see this story as it unfolds. So we have a couple of hands here. I'll moderate this next period. I think we have a little more than 5 minutes, I guess. It looks like Mauricio first, and then Nigel. Oh, sorry, did I do that right? Yeah, I think that's right. And then Narayan.
Yeah.
I think Nigel was there first, but please go ahead, Nigel. I'll follow up.
You too, kind Mauricio. You go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Rocío. Very interesting, and we definitely want to see the rest of the research as it unfolds. I was fortunate enough to visit the Tambopata Reserve nearly 10 years ago, and I have very fond memories of that. And I'm wondering if, within the context of the PPAs, how is ecotourism seen by the owners? Like, is it seen as maybe a potential source of revenue, and like maybe getting more recognition and power, or is it seen like maybe too intrusive, problematic? Just a fake way to maybe enhance conservation? Like, did that come up at any point in your research?
Yes, thanks for the question, Mauricio. Yeah, like I think land managers are kind of split in, many of them are doing ecotourism and quite well. Before the pandemic, they were doing like great financially, and like it was a very responsible venture from outside. However, some have that concern that if they start doing ecotourism, then like it's too many people, like too much noise for the animals. So there's some people who don't want to do it, but they are still thinking of new ideas to kind of do tourism. Like some people have talked about starting a club for people, like they can go camping there. So it's like less invasive. But yeah, and actually so in Tambopata, there are some PPAs that are actually connected, like 7 of them are together, and all of them are doing tourism. And I think once one starts doing that, then like the others follow, and it actually helps the area way more than if it was like only one PPA.
Thank you very much.
Great, Nigel, your turn.
Yeah, thanks, Rocío. That was amazing, and I love the pictures. Like Mauricio, I also have an experience in Peru that seeing this makes me, automatically think of. But it's the Huayhuash Reserve in the south of the Cordillera Blanca. I think it's composed of 4 different private protected areas, and as far as I understand, those 4 areas are in somewhat of a conflict with the idea that they should be categorized as a reserve or a national reserved area, or that's how they're defined now. And the idea is, should it be taken over by the government, or should those 4 communities continue to organize it? And I know that they do collect fees from hikers who complete the circuit, the Cordillera Huayhuash circuit. And I'm wondering how that factors into, one of your initial slides said that there's a lack of instrumental values or incentives. And I know you mentioned that none of them are millionaires, but I'm wondering if, given kind of the general, I believe, poverty of high Andean communities, if that money could be considered an instrumental value or part of that motivation for wanting to maintain management of those 4 areas.
Yeah, great question. So I actually just focus on PPAs that are managed by individuals or families, so not by local communities, because that was going to be a whole other logistic on trying to do a Zoom interview with local communities. And actually, there's a lot of talk here with NGOs that local communities should be a separate category of PPA, because many of them are created by NGOs or pushed by NGOs to create their own PPA. So it's not the same origin story, right? Like individuals or families, from my understanding so far, is like they want this and no one, like perhaps someone like pushes them to create the PPA, but they know it's their responsibility. Well, local communities, there's an NGO almost every time behind them, and because the president of the community changes every 2 years, so governance is quite challenging. So yeah, there's many problems with local communities right now and PPAs. Like even some individual PPAs struggle helping out local communities. So for sure, I don't know if that answers your question.
It's an interesting distinction that I didn't think of, so thank you for that.
Great. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Narayan?
Oh yeah, hi. My question was whether there are any indigenous people living on PPAs who practice traditional lifestyles.
Yeah, thanks Narayan for that. So actually there are, I think, 3 PPAs that are managed by indigenous communities, which are different from local communities. And from my understanding, so far it's working out well. But no, but there's, if then individuals or families have a PPA because they need a property right, so no one else should be living inside that property before they create the PPA, because it's private property, right? So it's no one else should be there.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we should wrap up, and so that we don't eat up on Madison's time. I'll request David Boyd to introduce Madison now.
Thanks very much, Kushank. And well, thanks for that terrific presentation, Rocío. And I'm delighted to be here today because I'm actually a member of Rocío's committee and a member of Madison's committee. So Maddie joined us a few years ago, actually as a master's student, and then fast-tracked into the PhD program because she's such a brilliant young scholar. And she's working on the confluence of human rights, biodiversity conservation, and community forests, working in with the venerable institution of the Van Panchayats in Uttarakhand in northern India, in the shadow of the Himalayas. And Maddie came to us with a really fascinating background. She's done wildlife conservation work with various organizations around the world, from Africa to northern Manitoba. And she and I share an affinity for whales, so that became a good connection early on in our journey together. So I'm just going to stop there. Maddie's also a UBC public scholar, and really looking forward to your talk here, Maddie. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. I'm going to share my screen here. So thanks David for the introduction, and also thank you to Rocío for a fascinating presentation. It's such a treat to be able to share the seminar with someone whose work shares so many synergies with mine. So this has been a really interesting journey. Like Rocío's, the research that I'm presenting today is a bit of a work in progress, so I'm very excited to hear all of your feedback. Though our contexts are different, both Rocío and I focus on examples of conservation that occur outside the conventional parks paradigm. The types of the protected areas we work in are not inviolate, peopleless areas administered by a remote state. They're actively lived in and tended by people. And in these places, we find enormous complexity and diversity of relationships with nature, perceptions, values, and stewardship choices. And in beginning this way, I want to underscore the acknowledgement that we're joining today from many different places whose original stewards have long cared for these lands. In my case, the many Great Plains nations, including Apsaluke, Nimipu, and Piikani, who have shared this part of southwestern Montana as a gathering place. So I thank them for their care of the places that we also call home. Most of us here are probably familiar with the legacy of human rights violations in protected areas, and in particular, the long-standing disregard for the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Increasingly, these communities are gaining legal recognition of their rights at multiple scales to make decisions about their territories, and also recognition of their key role in the flourishing of biodiversity. In this study, I use the framework of the lawscape to understand the distribution of rights and responsibilities across the landscape. Tikli Lerveranta writes, the lawscape of the community forest emerges in encounters with humans and non-humans, intertwining with assemblages of formal law. And she describes community forest boundaries as defined by a sense of familiarity among those who belong to the forest, which is fostered through repetitive access, use, and stories. And then, which is also fostered through negotiation with outside actors, including neighboring communities and others such as governing authorities. And importantly in this theory, the place itself matters. So countering a colonial understanding of property rights as exclusive, with fixed boundaries, and primarily referring to the relationships between people, the theory of lawscape foregrounds the relationship between people and place. And this means that the way that law is enacted on the landscape is locally determined by its biogeographical characteristics, the activities and agency of non-humans, human practices and their formalization in customary norms, in addition to the statutory legal framework, which we usually refer to as the law. And all of these dimensions interact and overlap to form the lawscape. I'm setting aside the non-human dynamics here, but it's a fascinating thing to me, and I'm looking forward to exploring it in other parts of my research. So for now, I'm applying this theory in the context of research in the mountain state of Uttarakhand, India. And specifically, I've been working in Pithoragarh district, in a high mountain valley called Johar. Historically, this was an important trade route which connected the Tibetan Plateau and the Indian subcontinent via 3 treacherous mountain passes, which are over 5,000 meters. This route was controlled by the Bhotia people, an indigenous people who now represent about 15% of the valley's population. And this photo was taken in a village called Pato at about 2,000 meters elevation, which has just a spectacular view south down the valley. It took my field assistant and I about 6 hours on foot to get here from the road on the opposite slope there. There are about 80 villages in this valley, which range from 900 meters or so on the Goriganga River below, you can see it peeking out there, to over 3,400 meters in the high alpine borderlands. And even within a few hundred meters, the climates and ecosystems are vastly different, depending on the slope aspect and elevation. And I love the way that this photo illustrates how this landscape is so dominated by the vertical, so much so that instead of right and left, directions are usually given in up, up, down, down, upar, upar, niche, niche, uphill or down valley. And those two dimensions give you enough to know where to go. Given the long history of trade, there's vibrant cultural diversity here, in addition to rich biodiversity. Dozens of endemic orchids, over 300 species of birds, charismatic mammals like tigers, snow leopards, and white-bellied musk deer. And most of this biodiversity is found in community forests. They represent almost 70% of the land area in the valley. And the remainder is mostly reserve forest, which is owned and managed by the Uttarakhand State Forest Department, which also includes a couple of protected areas. This is a place that's undergoing rapid legal, social, and environmental change. Livelihoods once based on pastoralism and trade largely gave way to subsistence agriculture. But now people are rapidly leaving the mountains in search of opportunities in the urban centers of the plains. Once home to over 100 families, for example, now only about 13 households live in Pato, and only a handful of them still carry on seasonal migration up and down the valley with their livestock. Despite this outmigration, though, forests remain vital to human well-being, crucial as a sort of social safety net. And many of the forest managers I spoke to see their role as pivotal in conserving this valley for future generations. One of them told me, "The jungle is worship for us. If there is jungle, there is everything. If there is jungle, there is water. Jungle is mother. Jungle is father. It is everything. What more is there to say?" I'm going to briefly zoom out for some context here. Beginning with the Indian Forest Act of 1865, forests were nationalized during the colonial administration, and these exclusionary policies continued into the post-independence era. Grassroots activists have slowly clawed back some recognition of their forest rights in law, notably with the advent of joint forest management in the 90s, and more recently with the Forest Rights Act in 2006. But one of the earliest examples, actually, of rights-based forest policy in India was introduced in 1931 in what's now Uttarakhand. To quell widespread unrest by local communities, protesting state control of forests, the Kumaon Forest Panchayat Act established an institution called the Van Panchayat. And in each village, a council of elected rights holders manages the Van Panchayat for the purpose of providing benefits to communities and also protecting forests. Today in Uttarakhand, there are over 12,000 Van Panchayats, covering about 10% of the land area. And these range in size from a few acres to over 20 square kilometers, from alpine meadows to lowland subtropical forests. Formally speaking, this is how they're supposed to work. The rights holders, the forest user group, elect forest councils every 5 years, with oversight by the state revenue department. Then, the Forest Council calls meetings and makes decisions about how to manage the Van Panchayat, and they get management input and planning oversight from the Uttarakhand State Forest Department, which can also take direct action. So the state retains ownership of the land, but devolves most of the management rights to communities. As some of you might know, and David hinted at as well, there's been substantial scholarly work on Van Panchayats. They've been described in environmental history and sociology as an organizing body for social resistance by Ramachandra Guha and others. In political ecology as a catalyst for emerging environmental subjectivities or environmentalities in a hugely influential piece of work by Anand Agrawal that no doubt many of you are familiar with. And recently as an example of a commons institution which is failing to meet human needs, failing to protect forests. Much of this literature, though, is focused on lower elevation areas where Van Panchayats account for a much smaller fraction of the landscape, and ecosystems are less biodiverse than they are further in the mountains. And importantly, most of these studies in terms of governance have focused on individual Van Panchayats, rather than looking at their contribution to the landscape as a whole, or the specific interactions between villages. So the broader question that is guiding my dissertation work is, how are forest councils navigating their stewardship roles vis-a-vis neighboring communities, non-human cohabitants, and governing authorities amid uncertainty and change? But for the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing more specifically on the questions guiding this chapter. Namely, how do communities differentially perceive, depend on, and care for different types of forest? And what are the implications of this lawscape for ecosystems, people, and the viability of Van panchayats as an institution? This analysis is grounded in the perspectives of community forest managers. So in 2019, 2020, in the winter, I spent about 3 months living in homestays in 2 different villages here. And I spent my days mostly walking to neighboring communities to sit down with people, share chai, and just talk about Van panchayats. I spent a lot of time listening, and participant observation was hugely important in this work. And in addition to these kind of ethnographies, I also carried out a legal document analysis. I'm happy to answer some more methodological questions later, but for now, I'll just note that this research is carried out in partnership with Hima Prakriti, which is a local civil society organization. Like most of us, my research was disrupted by COVID. This phase of the research was intended as a scoping study, so this wasn't supposed to be the main body of data for my dissertation, but instead of going back, which was impossible last year, I'm now in the process of developing a survey to run remotely with the help of field assistants to try and gather more data. So in this research, I asked participants questions about their stewardship activities, the threats they were facing, the benefits they derived from forests, and how all this fits together. And this is what I found. Local rights holders depend on benefits from Van panchayats directly for resources such as fuelwood and livestock fodder. Indirectly, they rely on these forests for services like mitigating human-wildlife conflict and maintaining resilience to disasters. A broader set of stakeholders at regional to global scales also benefit from these forests through the conservation of biodiversity, water security, and more. In turn, local stakeholders and rights holders exert direct pressures on Van panchayats, such as overharvest of forest products and fires. These threats are then compounded by factors such as capacity limitations and corruption. Indirectly, global processes of change, which affect all of our work, such as market pressures and climate change, also influence the provision of benefits in Van panchayats. So forest councils work at multiple levels to mitigate these threats and promote these services by building awareness and capacity, imposing restrictions on resource use, enforcing rules, and developing the forest by planting trees and more. And they also gather revenue, of course, to support these activities. But in looking beyond this a little more closely at how people talked about the relationships of stewardship and use among different Van panchayats in the same area, my key finding was this. Dependence on forest is highly entangled, with rights holders in each village relying not only on their own forest, but on neighboring Van panchayats and government-managed reserve forests for their well-being. Yet, the management of each forest type is remarkably discrete. Say you have 2 villages on opposite slope aspects, one south and one north. A family on the north-facing slope, while they have plenty of fuelwood in their own forest, may not be able to feed their livestock without the grazing land found on the opposite side. Yet, they also have no say in decisions about how that forest is managed, and are entirely at the mercy of the decisions made by that forest council. So, though deeply entangled, both socially and ecologically, each parcel is managed as if it's an island. And there are a few important consequences of this model. 1, perceptions of responsibility and stewardship activities vary significantly by forest type and tenure. One of the participants in this research, an NGO employee and a member of one of the Van panchayats, said, all of the activities communities are undertaking in the Van panchayats, they're doing them in order to strengthen the forest. They manage so well in their own Van panchayats. But in adjacent areas, if there are reserve forests, they think, this is not ours. They do damage in that forest, while at the same time thinking about how to conserve their Van panchayat. So resource users' sense of belonging then to a particular area affects the nature of their use and whether or not they'll adhere to rules, which in turn, of course, affects the forest condition. And this causes spillover effects. So indirectly, the consequences of poor management, either in reserve forests or in neighboring Van panchayats, affects the health of each Van panchayat. one of the participants, a forest council member, told me, the government and forest department are also using our forest. And instead of conserving that forest, they're destroying it. There's also Sarkari jungle, government forest, and they're not taking good care of it. Because they are destroying their forest, we are being affected because we're getting less water. And management decisions also cause direct spillover effects on forests as dependence and use are displaced from poorly managed areas onto well-managed areas, which still do have resources. For example, if a neighboring village does not take care of their Van Panchayat, a forest council member told me, personally, this doesn't cause us any harm. But if we look at it from an area perspective, then they could get, it does harm us. If they would have their Van Panchayat in good condition, then they could get grass and wood from their Van Panchayats. But they don't have theirs, so obviously they'll come to ours to steal. It is obviously their loss, but with respect to the jungle, it's also our loss. And another way this can happen in terms of spillover, which is kind of contradictory to the previous point, is that use can be displaced from well-enforced areas onto poorly enforced ones. So as a result, communities are increasingly engaging in a form of local fortress conservation. As concerns about encroachment are rising, Van Panchayat boundaries are becoming increasingly fortified against incursion by people who are perceived as outsiders. And these outsiders are understood as being more or less legitimate users of the forest, depending on their level of need, whether they're perceived as part of the community or not, and what types of activities they're undertaking. Transhumant pastoralists, so people who move livestock up and down the valley seasonally, are particularly affected by this, as they're increasingly crowded out of their grazing rights, especially in the middle elevations, and they're the first to be scapegoated for damage to the forest.
Maddie, you have 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. So because of all of this exclusion and a lack of government presence, the reserve forests are particularly treated as open access areas, and there's not that much sense of responsibility extended to these government-owned and administered forests. Finally, all of this results in a heavy burden of enforcement for Van Panchayats. So most of their resources end up being spent on walls and patrols rather than on planting or on restoring stream banks or other important forms of management. And the last implication of this kind of discrete management paradigm is that there's very limited coordination and knowledge sharing across Van Panchayats. Recent amendments to the Forest Panchayat Act have given more control to governing authorities, which poses risks to the management rights of communities. But without coordination, many communities are not aware of these rules or they're unable to effectively protest against these developments. It also makes it more difficult to address collective environmental threats like fires and disaster mitigation, or to prevent overharvesting and forest damage. Ultimately, I think the main point here is that if communities are seeing their neighbors as adversaries, or especially if they see newcomers as adversaries, the result is a worsening of the spillover effects that we see, an exclusion of vulnerable people from rights in Van Panchayats, and an arms race towards who can have the toughest enforcement. And this really causes problems for everyone. But despite these challenges, many local resource managers in Johar see Van Panchayats as the driving force between conservation efforts. There are opportunities here too. Women in some of the villages where I carried out my research have been playing an increasingly prominent role in decision-making, even though they face a significantly uphill battle in terms of exercising their rights. And they're starting to really spearhead connections and alliances between Van Panchayats. There's also a widespread perception that cooperation is key to maintaining effective stewardship. So forest managers are really actually eager to build a model that's not just fragmented, but more like a mosaic, contributing to a shared vision. The customary decision-making model which works here is really flexible and can be very responsive to hyper-local changes to environmental condition and people's needs. So that nimbleness, I think, can be a real asset when things change rapidly, especially if it's paired with coordination. And finally, spillover is not all bad. Good management begets good outcomes. and better forest condition in one parcel can help the resilience of neighboring forests and communities. So as I've discussed here, the lawscape of forests in Johar comprises a complex mosaic of use and access regimes and management models. So I've started this project by using these qualitative data to sort of thematically map out the ways in which Van Panchayat stewardship shapes the lawscape. Next, as I mentioned briefly, I'm hoping to conduct a household survey in order to test these hypotheses more systematically among a broader set of stakeholders in a few different clusters of villages in the valley. And I'm very curious to hear any input on or suggestions about that as well. I'm also, as soon as it's feasible, perhaps next year, hoping to return to Uttarakhand and spend some time in Johar, not only to sort of share results and maybe do a little bit more research, but really to just foster an ongoing connection here. I think what's been most inspiring for me in this research is the engagement of community members that I'm working with, and I'm really looking forward to deepening and continuing those relationships. So a huge thanks to the institutions which have supported and funded the work, my committee for their guidance, and in particular the communities in Johar who've been so gracious with their time, so patient with my Hindi language skills, and just so committed to this research. I've really appreciated everything they've done for me in this process. And thank you all for listening. Thanks so much for being here. And thanks once again to Rocío. This has been such a treat.
Great, thanks very much, Madison. And yeah, really impressive to see how, well, both you and Rocío have overcome the difficulties imposed by the pandemic on research. And that was a really interesting talk and terrific photographs too, by the way. So we'll open the floor now. Just you can just use the raised hand feature and we'll take a few questions in the time that remains. So I think we've got Narayan up first.
Hi, that was such a beautiful presentation to both of you. I have a quick question about the people in this area, because you mentioned the population has decreased due to urbanization, but there's so many other people in other parts of India who are being displaced due to climate change, and the population of the country is increasing. So is there a possibility of having other people resettled here just so they can potentially have a safe place to live?
My initial thought is that if especially in terms of climate change, this is not a safe place to live. It's a place which is increasingly exposed to pretty dramatic climate risks, and this was kind of put on display last summer when Pithoragarh had really intense flooding, which killed many people, and they're increasingly exposed to disasters. I think the reality of that is unlikely. However, COVID has presented a kind of interesting shift in this trend where actually a lot of people have been migrating back. People who used to live here have been migrating back home. And the rural areas in Uttarakhand have seen a huge influx of people. And I know the Uttarakhand government is sort of scrambling to try to keep them there and give them jobs and make sure there are opportunities in order for them to stay, particularly for economic reasons for the state. But it's kind of uncertain at this point whether or not that will continue or if people will just kind of go back to lives as usual after this.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Narayan. Any other questions for Maddie? Questions from faculty? Okay, well, Kushank, did you want to give us a sneak preview of next week's seminar?
Hadi has a question. Sorry.
Hadi's sneaking in with a question. Hadi, over to you.
Hi, Maddie. A great talk, and both great talks. My question is, you talked about a very vastly different scale of of independently managed entities. Can you talk a little bit about any difference in the way these are managed, the resources they have, whether even the very large, the 20 square kilometer one has the same kind of interdependencies with its neighbors or not? That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hadi, for the question. So yeah, as you mentioned, and as I noted, these are incredibly diverse in terms of the types of landscapes and then the size. I think two things to note about the large size of panchayats is they tend to be more alpine, so they tend to be more kind of grazing lands, and they also tend to be established first. So I spoke to a lot of people who felt that kind of in the early days of establishing these panchayats, the communities which had more power, a little bit more access to resources, kind of quickly grabbed as much as they could. And those kind of inequities where these smaller panchayats were usually established later and in more marginal land. So those inequities persist. In terms of actual resources, the alpine panchayats, which are usually larger, tend to be more important for grazing, tend to be more important for the collection of medicinal plants. So they tend to be, generally speaking, more lucrative for sure. The direct reliance, especially on the alpine ones, is more seasonal as well because they're not used in the summers. But I think there is actually strong interdependence still, and in that case, it's actually not so much neighboring panchayats as it is mid-valley or lower valley panchayats. So, to give an example, herding families who have panchayat rights up in the high alpine area, and who use and access those resources in the summer, need to rely on the good management of panchayats in the middle of the valley and lower down in the valley, to which they don't have rights in other seasons. And so there are management interactions which are happening not only sort of spatially, but based on communities' movement and the dynamics of different households' strategies for accessing resources. So that's an interesting piece that I'd really like to get into in this. But certainly, I think the discrepancy in the scale is really important. In this valley, the largest panchayat is about 2 kilometers squared. So it's not quite the 20 kilometers that I mentioned. And the smallest is probably about 10 hectares. So it's a slightly smaller distribution, but still pretty important. And sorry.
Groups have the right to trespass?
So access is kind of, none of these groups has the right to exclude anyone from access. Anyone can go into the forest, but they can't bring their livestock there and they can't use products without rights. So to do that, they have to get a pass. So most people who are needing resources from another panchayat buy a pass from that council in order to use those resources or to move animals through.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Any last questions? We have a minute left. Nigel.
Maddie, it would just be great to hear what you're hoping to find with the survey, what your next steps are.
Thanks. Yeah, what I'm really hoping to do is actually try to do a bit more mapping visually. What I'm planning to do is do household surveys in 3 different clusters in the valley. One kind of towards the urban-ish center that's here, the town of Munchari, one about midway up the valley, and one in the higher alpine, and look at a few different nearby panchayats, and specifically ask questions about dependence on different resources, as well as exercise of stewardship responsibilities. And I'm still in the process of figuring out how those data might be visualized, but I could see something like flow diagrams where you have the different parcels and different resources going sort of back and forth. I also am really curious to ask more about relationships with non-humans, with wildlife in particular. So that's something that I'm going to be looking at too. And I hope to just kind of both test these findings that are based on interviews with Forest Council members, as well as figure out a way to visualize these data from a household perspective. But still in progress.
Thank you, Madison.
Thank you.
Okay, before closing, I'd quickly like to thank Madison and Rocío for such a wonderful presentation and engaging presentation. Yep, I'll close the session now. Hope to see you guys next time.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you too. Wonderful presentations.
That was super, Maddie. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just reading through the comments in the chat.